welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. In today's video, we continue to explore the legacy of the ever-imaginative, ever-inventive Franz Liszt. Today we move to some of the visionary works of Liszt's later compositional period with the piece called Nuages gris, or Gray Clouds, written in 1881, and an Impromptu in F-sharp major, written in 1872. The really incredible thing to me about the later works of Liszt is that it's possible to discern just about every individual musical development of the first decades of the 20th century in Liszt's works. This despite the fact that Liszt did not even live to see the 1890s. There was a remarkable branching of styles in the first decade of the 20th century as composers of various nationalities and philosophies found a myriad of ways in which to face the inevitable exhaustion of the standard tonal system as it was practiced in the late 19th century. Some sought to revive tonality by reference to the authentic folkloric music of their countries. Some tried to use tonal chords but to divest them of their structural significance, lessening the definition of a strict dissonance. So a dominant seventh chord for Debussy, for example, no longer had to resolve in the usual way. Instead of being used as a means to an end, it could instead be used as a pure sound effect for its own aesthetic value. And some tried to reach back to ancient classical or quote-unquote savage musical idioms like Satie or Stravinsky. Of course, the most revolutionary development was the attempt to actually do away with standard tonal harmony altogether. Not just tonal harmony, but even the idea of centricity around a home key or tonic. Germany's Arnold Schoenberg and his disciples Anton Webern and Alban Berg are, of course, the most famous examples of this, with the invention of free atonality, followed closely by the 12-tone method of composition. But they weren't the only ones. The Italian Ferruccio Busoni and the Russian Alexander Scriabin, each on their own, succeeded in devising a totally unique musical language that was largely independent of standard tonality and centricity. Well, the really extraordinary thing is that all of these trends can be discerned nascently in one form or another in Liszt's works, particularly his later works. His darkly hued, Hungarian-imbued experimental works, like the Hungarian Rhapsodies numbers 16 through 19, the Chardas Macabre, and the Totentanz for piano and orchestra, directly paved the way for Bartók's extraordinary music, which was such a perfect synthesis of Hungarian and Romanian folk music into his own deeply personal musical language. In pieces like Jeu à la vie d'Est, Liszt directly looks forward to the impressionist neoclassical world of Ravel. Ravel even paid homage to that work by using the title Jeu for one of his earliest groundbreaking piano pieces. Liszt even foresaw the eventual dissolution of tonality with a piece like the Bagatelle without tonality, written in 1885, shortly before his death. Liszt did not have the time or energy to pursue every path to its natural conclusion, but he predicted them in his own compositions. Our two pieces today, to my mind, bring three very different composers of a later generation: the Russian Alexander Scriabin, who I just mentioned, also Claude Debussy, and Gabriel Fauré. In Nuages gris, or the gray clouds, gloomy clouds, the ending harmony of the piece is strikingly similar to many chordal constructions that Scriabin later devised, involving a chord built on top of a tritone. Compare, for example, Scriabin's so-called Prometheus chord. In this same piece, Liszt also makes use of long stretches of parallel augmented triads. Now, the augmented triad was kind of a wild card. It was considered an unstable harmonic sound, as were all symmetrical constructions, like the diminished seventh chord as well. And usually it would be approached by voice leading and resolved in some way. It would be a kind of a way station between two more stable harmonies, kind of like a substitute for a dominant seventh chord. In fact, we saw this very use of it in Grieg's lyric pieces Opus 43, which were the topic of last week's video. Liszt's use of these parallel augmented chords, on the other hand, is a clear precursor to the compositional technique of harmonic planing, which one sees all the time in Debussy and later composers as well. There's no structural meaning to these chords, they're simply used for their sound quality alone. Also, there is a kind of aphoristic, incomplete feeling to this piece, and to many of Liszt's works at the time, that again looks forward to the often fragmentary, fleeting nature of works written in the early 20th century. This is as true of Scriabin as it is of Debussy, and also Schoenberg, and especially Webern. The final harmony of Nuages gris is not based in the home key of G minor, if you can even define the piece as having a home key, as it's so weakly established. Instead, the music just seems to kind of lose energy in the middle of a phrase and ends on the last harmony that we happened to hear before the music succumbed to this weariness. This feeling of melancholy and weariness is not surprising, considering that the piece was written in a very dark period of Liszt's life. He had, of course, already suffered the deaths of his children, Blandine and Daniel, many years before, but at this particular point in 1881, he had just suffered a very serious injury. He had fallen down a set of stairs and severely injured himself, and he had expected that he would recover quickly, more like when he was a young man, but instead he suffered a very prolonged convalescence. It was hard for him to move around and really just to function in any way. And it's not hard to understand the bleakness that must have come over him at these times. And the way that he channeled it was, as one would expect, through his music. The Impromptu, on the other hand, has a much more healthy kind of air about it, and an almost mystical kind of sensual quality. Although there's a slight reference to both Schubert and Chopin, of course, in the use of the title, also the key, and the opening harmonic voicing, this work really puts me in mind of the later works of Gabriel Fauré, particularly his late Impromptus, which it of course precedes by some decades. These late nocturnes and impromptus by Fauré have a similarly wandering, amorphous kind of tonal scheme with surprising interrelated chords, along with a diaphanous pianistic texture from which wayward voices seem to emerge and disappear unpredictably. The climax of the work is based in the highest register of the piano with these kind of pulsating, repeated chords, which again uncannily brings to mind the mystical, scintillating climaxes in Scriabin's late works. So by making these comments, I don't mean to suggest that these composers lifted anything from Liszt. They weren't plagiarizing. Quite the contrary, they were all strikingly original in their methods. However, it seems clear to me that most composers working in the first few decades of the 20th century were well acquainted with Liszt's later works, and that these works provided a kind of musical blueprint, a kind of impetus for experiments that they wished to follow in their own creative endeavors. The obvious high esteem that composers in the 20th century held Liszt's works in was despite the poor critical review that these works had had during the first half of the 20th century. For myself, quite beyond any question of their historical importance, I'm very attached to the mood and the feel of these spare, sometimes mystical, sometimes very personal utterances of Liszt's old age. Gone from his musical rhetoric is any question of dazzling instrumental virtuosity, although the pieces are oftentimes very challenging. Gone is any sense of posturing or heaven-storming histrionics. Instead, everything is crystallized and distilled to the most direct expression possible. There's an almost classical kind of clarity and economy to these works, and they can be astonishingly powerful in their effect when presented with sympathy and understanding of Liszt's style. So thank you very much for taking the time to get to know this music. Please be sure to comment, like the video, and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel financially as well if you can through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the description box below for those sites. Also, thank you again to all of my loyal financial supporters through Patreon and PayPal. I'll see you next week for some more great music and conversation.